Before today's topic, a quick disclaimer. The stories and data we share come from the states that we practice in and the experiences we personally had, which can differ greatly across our country and certainly the globe. This is not a professional advice show, so get comfy and let's discuss death.
Hello, and welcome to MortMic, a down-to-earth discussion on death and dying. I'm Jem.
And I am Red, and we're your Mortuary media moguls for the third time.
The third and final time.
The third and final time. Or is it? Sequel. So this week, we are continuing our little delve into death care and death-related topics in media. So episode 1, a few months back, we brought you television shows and movies. Last episode, we went through some really cool video games that tackled these topics. And this week, we saved some of the best for last. These are going to be books about death care, and everything in between. That we have read, and definitely stuff that for those out there that are bookworms will be added to your list pretty much immediately. There's a lot of good stuff in this week's episode.
Books. Even if you're not bookworms, I do not like reading, honestly, but my personal library at home is literally like 99.9% death books, and I've read all of them, and they're all super great, and I'm so excited to talk about them. It's actually funny. It's like one of the talking pieces. People that like come into my home, if they like take a look at my bookcase, they're like, "So you like death, huh?" I'm very, very proud of my collection. I'm so excited to talk about it.
Actually, you don't know this, Jem, but you're the reason that I started my own like death book collection. Because I had gone to Jem's house and saw his incredible bookshelf, and like he rented out. He did like a library thing where he allowed me to borrow a few of the books, and I'm like, yeah, this is pretty cool. I think I'm gonna do this too.
It's very cool, and there are like so many good books out there. Definitely excited to talk about the classics. And for those of you who hear the word death classics and you have no idea what we're talking about, I think some of the like there's like a bunch of books that people in the death care industry have read. If you like reference the author, like everyone knows what you're talking about. One of those books being the Kubler-Ross book. This is a book called On Death and Dying, and it was published in 1969. So one of the first...
Sorry.
You know, when I wrote this, I was like, I bet that Red's going to say that. And then I totally forgot about it until right now.
Oh no, I'm predictable.
So one of the first books kind of tackling death as more of less of a self-help topic and more of a like educational experiential topic. So basically the book is this Dr. Kubler-Ross, her accounting on dealing with dying patients and death in the medical field, and dealing with families and all of that kind of stuff. And this is back in 1969. So I mean, that was so long ago. Just like think about that. But this is like a classic of like what, kind of an experiential guide on like how to handle death in these sort of situations.
It's pretty much a staple for like a mortuary science college. Like they make you read it during your like psych classes and stuff.
So Kubler-Ross is actually the, I guess, quote unquote, developer of the stages of grief mechanism that we all learn and love in mortuary science psych classes. Red, I'm sure you could rattle it off for me right now.
See,
DABDA.
Yeah, no, honestly, I'll run us through it, but I will say before I do, I hate it. I hate her stages of grief. I hate it just because it's not, it was great for its time, but we have I feel like in today's modern society, it doesn't apply as well. So everyone's very familiar
Sure.
with it. There's even like a episode of Robot Chicken that does like a skit on this where you go through the stage of denial to anger to bargaining, and then you kind of start the incline back out to like depression and acceptance. But the problem with this is that it's not like a straight line. Some people start at different places. They
Oh
might
yeah.
start with anger, or they might skip something completely, or they might regress back into one of the stages. So I feel like people utilize it very inappropriately. They just think, okay, I start here and I end here. Like, that's not how that works.
Yeah.
So,
Sure. When I said know and love, I meant it was like drilled into our heads as students.
oh, that's fair. I'm
Um,
sorry.
You're
We're
fine.
starting the soapbox real early this episode.
Of course. Well, and thinking about it, so Dr. Kubler-Ross is a medical doctor. It's in academia too, like, especially back then, it's step by step. This is how it is. This is what the research shows. But now in the age of like, getting in touch with your feelings and understanding that people process grief differently, obviously it still is a good framework, but it's not like the said and done definition of everyone's grief for sure.
Aptly said.
Definitely a interesting read though if you're interested in like a death classic. Like if you want to, sound fancy schmancy at your, local funeral home dinner or whatever it is, brush up on your Kubler-Ross. So the next book that I want to talk about is my original exposure to the death industry. This is where it all started, folks. This is a book called Stiff by Mary Roach. And Mary Roach is like a writer, journalist, but she's written a lot of books on more like taboo subjects. So this book she wrote on like cadavers and like what happens to you after you die, like your physical body, like what happens to your physical body after you die. And this was an 11th grade summer reading assignment for me. My English teacher was especially macabre that year, I guess. And from this, I was like little 11th grade Jem. Like I had never really experienced any death. No one in my family had died. I had never been to a funeral. I didn't really know that funeral homes like as a job existed. So just reading this book for my summer reading assignment, it was the first book that I was like, I love this. I was like, I'm so interested. I want to know more. And it was the first kind of instance where I was reading about these funeral directors and these death professionals, and in the back of my mind I was like, I think that I could do this. Like I think that this is something that I want to do. Obviously fast forward a few years later for me actually entering the death industry, but this was like the first like how it all got started sort of thing. And I think it was for Red too, right?
Actually, yeah, mine happened a little later on. It was gifted to me by my family when I started my mortuary science college, and there was like a little note written on the inside of the cover that they wrote to me. It says, "A little light reading to get you started," and I thought that was really cool. So interesting that it was like our first book introduction
Yeah.
to this.
I still have my original copy from 11th grade.
Oh, really?
It's like my one possession. I'm a terrible minimalist and I get rid of everything I own on like yearly cycles, but it's like the one possession I have from high school still.
It brings you joy. You cannot get rid of
Yes.
it.
So if you have an interest in how bodies are handled post-mortem from more of in a historical sense, she goes over cannibalism to cryogenics to body farms to plastinization museums. So that's a really interesting read. I would recommend it to someone who doesn't want to get into the heavy stuff but is still interested about the death industry and what literature is out there for them. So kind of to boast about my collection of books in a little bit of ways, I have this one book that I am extremely proud of. It's called Death and the Right Hand, and it's by Robert Hertz, which is a French man. So it was written in 1907, translated in 1960 to English, but it's 2 essays in this one book, 2 scientific essays. One is about death, and the other one is about the predominance of right hand in society.
What?
So you can kind of see like, okay, yep, this book was written in 1907 for some reason. I found it in a used bookstore in New York City when I was living there, and it was like $2, and I just saw the word death and I was like, I need that. And then I read it further and I was like, what the heck? It's literally two totally separate essays that have nothing to do with each other in the same book. I just think it's so funny.
Maybe it's just like he didn't have enough content to like make a book on like them individually, so he's just like, nah, throw them together.
Just throw them together. But I do really like the death portion of the book. I think it's really interesting because it was written in 1907, so it's interesting to look back on some like thoughts about death like back in that period. One excerpt that I will quote just because I think it's very interesting and I'm very proud of this book. Death is a temporary exclusion of the individual from human society. Mourning is the necessary preparation of the living in the mortuary state of their relative, and lasts as long as this state itself. Death consists in a dual and painful process of mental disintegration and synthesis. It is only when this process is completed that society, its peace recovered, can triumph over death.
Jem, you got big brain. Like, I would
You
have
guys
to look
can
up
go.
half of that.
You can go replay that if you want. I just love it. It's just old timey, and it's so funny because it's like death and the predominance of the right hand because the left hand is evil. I love it.
So one that I had eagerly awaited reading for a while was Death's Acre. I had been chomping at the bit to do an episode on body farms, and I thought that this would be like a good starting point to kick it all off with the man himself who started it, Dr. Bill Bass, a forensic anthropologist. Have you read this book, Jem?
No, I haven't, but I've definitely heard about Mr. Dr. Bill.
Mr. Dr. Bill.
My good friend. I'm just kidding.
My good friend, Mr. Dr. Bill.
He's a very interesting person, though, for sure.
Yeah, for real. So this book timelines out his history leading up from him establishing what Patricia Cornwell, who's a mystery novelist, coined the body farm. And so this book talks about many different interesting cases in which he was able to use his skills to help identify bodies and uncover evidence to actually convict criminals. And it also goes into like success stories of his students who went on to establish their own methodologies to assist with like postmortem investigation and like actually are now commonplace practices in order to help solve cases.
There was really no research being done about this, and this is such an important part of forensics because, you know, especially when you're trying to ascertain like the time of death, you're trying to understand how to identify an individual that is severely decomposed or under, you know, certain environmental circumstances that have like changed the morphology of their body. This is so cool that he was just like, all right, we're going to take a bunch of, you know, scientifically donated cadavers and we're going to put them out in the field in different environments and we're going to see what happens. And that's like science. I love it.
And it's really cool because like some of the little theses that his students went on to do, stuff like, well, we don't, like, they would be approached about, like, well, how did this guy die? And they only have bones. And it's just like, well, it looks like a saw. And like, well, we need to know what kind of saw. Otherwise, we can't convict. And so, like, one of his students went on to just, like, buy hundreds and hundreds of different types of saws and just saw into bones with them to actually see what they look like at a microscopic level so they could use it in cases. Like, just such cool science in this book.
Mm-hmm. I think one of my favorite things that I heard about the bodies is that they would put like a body half in shade and half in sunlight and like see what happened to that body. It's like things you don't think about that, but like you need to know because that definitely affects the decomposition rate. If half the body is cool and half of it is hot, like what does happen? Very cool stuff.
So unfortunately, this book is older, and so there's not like a whole lot of meat and potatoes about the body farm itself. It had only been up and running for like 20 years upon the writing of the book, and like another 20 has passed since the publishing of it. So like that's why I definitely want to have an entire episode about this because now we have a lot more to talk about. Like it's a nice jumping off point to start with this book. Especially for people who like true crime and science, but definitely just whets the appetite to be like, okay, now I need to go find out more, because there's so much cool stuff that is in and around this that has spawned because this awesome doctor decided to do something kind of crazy.
And now there are more body forms out there too, which is like just so wild how this is like carried, and it's such important research to be done. Very cool stuff. On sort of a more lighthearted side, there are also a lot of these books around that are like kind of like short stories / tell-all books about the death industry. Obviously, the layperson is not exposed to the behind-the-scenes aspects of like, you know, being a funeral director or like being a body removal technician. And people are curious. People want to know. Like, you know, when people meet me and, you know, they find out or whatever, they're like, oh, tell me a story. What's a good story that you have? And of course, always on the spot, I'm like, So this is a nice kind of collection of short stories that is an answer to that question. So many of these stories are true. I think all of them are true. They've been kind of curated by 2 authors, but they are true stories from people that either submitted them or people that the author spoke to. Obviously, a lot of the stories have been like quote unquote sanitized to protect the identities of certain individuals involved in the stories. But these stories, they're well written and they're interesting. I read the whole thing, and all the stories are very different, but, you know, entertaining in their own way. You have the stories ranging from the unfortunate mortician who lost his wallet after sending off a body to another state, only to receive a call that his wallet had been found by the receiving funeral director in the decedent's coffin, to a particular widow who was doing her due diligence to ensure that her husband was buried commando. There are even some more serious tales that showcase the best and worst of mortuary care, because morticians are, you know, people just like you and me. And that's what I really like about this book. It kind of, you know, gives that idea that, you know, we're just people and funny stuff happens to us too. So
This is actually the book that I borrowed from Jem to start my own collection. So I own a copy of this now myself because of you.
yeah, it's just a very nice, also a light read if someone's like, hey, what's a good book about funeral directors? Like, I feel like this is a good one.
Yeah, it's not too overwhelming. You can finish it in an afternoon, to be honest. It's good.
Mm-hmm.
So this next book is one I actually had mentioned in a previous episode where we talked about post-mortem photography and like death and dying photography, and it's called Beyond the Veil. So that the episode we did on death art, we kind of showcased this in the photography section. And like, this is like, aesthetically, this is a gorgeous book cover to cover. It's got like a black binding, and like the pages are golden rimmed, and inside of it, it's got 120 photos of death and mourning photography. And it ranges from like the Victorian era all the way through the 20th century. It was an absolute trip going through the familiarities of like modern funeral customs to peering into the customs of days of yore, and like all the similarities and differences therein. This is a must-have as like a coffee table flip book for those that have little attention span for novels and the like, and just like looking at pictures.
Yeah, I've seen some of these photos before on like the internet, but to have like a nice, like big, glossy, like Red said, coffee table book with all these pictures in it, I would love this. I do not have this book yet. I feel like I must buy it now. But it's definitely a talking point. So another book that is kind of like a quote unquote like classic death industry book that's more non-fictional, sort of like biographical, like a research piece on the UK death system, is Representations on Death by Mary Bradbury. And this was published in 1999. So this was one of the first in-depth public looks into the mortuary world. When I was looking for books on death in like 2008, when I was a little 11th grader yearning for more books about death, this was one of the few that popped up back then. So this was kind of a staple back before talking about death got popular or whatever. But basically, it's like a kind of a heavy, more educational research piece if you're someone who wants to look into the more like sociological and historical aspects of like the UK death system, which is the death system that our death system was based off of. So if you want to read something more like that, I would recommend this book called Representations on Death by Mary Bradbury. Another lighter book that is kind of like a tell-all in from someone who worked in the funeral home business is 9 Years Under by Sherry Booker, and this is a kind of an autobiographical coming of age story from an inner city funeral home worker. And Sherry Booker started working at this funeral home when she was 15 years old, and she worked there for 9 years, obviously, hence the title of the book. And it's just another one of those books where, you're like, funeral directors are people too. Like it talks about aspects of the funeral home as a random 15-year-old who's coming to work there. She works her ways up the ranks. She never becomes a funeral director. She just works there as like, visitation staff, admin. I think she does like, helps out with, all aspects of funeral homes as one would in like a smaller inner city funeral home. So I thought it was really interesting to see that side of things because I have not worked in an inner city funeral home, and it's definitely a different atmosphere, a different environment, but she's just a really good writer. And I think it's definitely a more palatable way to explore like what it's like working in a funeral home at like not as a funeral director, just as like a regular person.
This sounds really interesting. I'm definitely going to have to check this one out.
Yeah, 9 Years Under. It's also very easy to read. Very, very easy. And I wanted to make like an honorable mention for all of those anime nerds out there. I have a manga in my collection called Kurosagi, Kurosagi, Corpse Delivery Service. And this is a manga written and illustrated by Eiji Otsuka. This is a manga where a group of college friends start a body removal and delivery service in Japan. This obviously immediately piqued my interest because that was one of my favorite jobs that I ever had. Of course, this has to be a little bit interesting for, public consumption. So in the group of students use their special abilities in order to help the dead cross over. So I think one of them is like can see ghosts and talk to ghosts. Another one of them channels an extraterrestrial being through a hand puppet that he wears on his hand at all times. And they just go around and like help these dead people like move on in life. And it's a little bit of like Japanese horror, but more so of like kind of like a slice of lifey type mystery story about these like college kids that are going around like picking up dead bodies and stuff. I don't know. I really, really like it. It's out of print, unfortunately, but you might be able to find it on like one of those manga websites or whatever have you.
Has manga gone too far? That is crazy.
I love it. And it's an older book. Like it got released like a while ago. So I love it. I think it's so cool.
I am waiting with open arms for the anime adaptation to this. When they finally end One Piece, they better start this.
Let's hope so.
So, of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention a few of the works that were written by Caitlin Doty. She is the lead figurehead in youth forward-thinking funeral industry practices and death positivity. Honestly, I often get asked if I watch her videos and read her books, so I think it's high time that we finally cover some of her content.
Yeah, we have talked about her like a lot in this podcast just because she's like Red said, like she's the it girl in the death positivity industry, and has a lot to say and has a lot out there. So she does have a couple books actually. I remember, back when I first got into reading death books back in the day, she only had the one that came out, and we'll talk about it first. It's called Smoke It's in Your Eyes.
I read this book a while back when I was fresh out of mortuary science school, and so I don't remember like all the details, but I feel like this would be a good starting book if you're looking to get into Caitlin's work as her first book. So essentially, what this covers, it's like her autobiography on her path into and then through the death care industry. So like it starts with her time when she was a crematory operator, and then moves on to her attending mortuary science college, and then like why all of her collective experiences transitioned her into like what she advocates for today, which is like that demystification of the death and dying process, the death positivity, and also exploring alternative options after someone dies.
Yeah, I read this book as well, like right when it first came out, I think. And it's definitely just interesting. Like it's just about her life, and she kind of goes into some personal stuff about like she's from Hawaii, and why she decided to get into like the niche sort of like soapbox that she's on all the time about death positivity, and how she started the Order of the Good Death, and great things like that. So I did like reading it and like kind of understanding like where she came from and like how she started doing what she's doing. It's really good too if you're just interested in getting started on your own journey into death positivity.
She also went on to write a book called From Here to Eternity, which was actually gifted to me by my friend James for a Christmas present last year. So I finally got around to reading it. And this was a really fun read. And in it, she documents some of like the varied funeral practices that we find around the globe. So like ones she actually got to attend and participate in herself. So, like, she explores, like, open fire cremation society in Colorado, ceremonies where the dead walk again in Indonesia, expressive festivities of the Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, and, like, a corpse hotel in Japan. There's so much more. It's really cool.
That's one I actually haven't read yet, but that does sound really cool. You got me at Corpse Hotel. I was like,
right?
I was like, maybe. And then Corpse Hotel, I was like, yep. Gotta read that one.
It's going on the shelf. Yep.
And then her last book, I think, right? She just has the 3.
Yeah, I think it's just the 3. Mm-hmm.
So her last book is called Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs? And this is a book answering some of the more interesting questions she's received about death during her time as a death care professional. I've read a little bit of this because it is like one of those. It's like a toilet book, like the books that they have next to the potty that you just flip through and you're like, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So I flipped through it when I got it, and I read some of the things. I flipped to the Will the Cat Eat My Eyeball section, and yeah, she literally just talks about Yep, they will do that. Yes.
Cats have no loyalty after you die. 0.
They're hungry. But it's one of those fun reads that's like, oh, you like death stuff? Like here's a fun, Christmas gift or whatever. I think it's really just kind of entertaining and interesting. And, she does her research and she knows what she's talking about. So most of the stuff that she answers is definitely, it's going to be accurate. You don't have to worry about that.
So, Jem, do you know what time it is? It is soapbox time.
Soapbox time.
So, this has been something I've wanted to touch on for a while because we do bring her up so often. I just kind of like want to set the tone of like where I agree with her and where I don't. And like, honestly, I congratulate Caitlin on the strides that she's made to bring positivity to death and to take away that like scary shroud bestowed by today's society. But like, I really don't agree with all of her viewpoints. She's always mentioned the outcome of the ceremony and the body is up to the family at the end of the day. And as we all should support as death care professionals, that's how we all should look at it. But I feel because like she does tend to swing so far left with some of her ideologies, it like steamrolls over a lot of like the middle of the road persons. Like it's very left leaning, which is a little difficult for some people to digest, I think. And Like even if death positivity was accepted by everybody, there's still those, especially like in the Western world, that might not be want to be involved in like preparation of their loved one, and would prefer like the convenience of just the funeral home taking over and taking care of the details, so they can just focus in on their grief. So like a kind of like a side note, something I found interesting when I was looking up, like I checked out our funeral home website and I looked up pricing on there, and it's actually like kind of comparable to some of the firms that I've worked for. So I thought like that was kind of interesting because I know she always mentions that like she thinks that things are overpriced, and they are.
This is something that I will also just like say a little piece on, because I like, I do love the work that she does, and I am very, enamored by the work that she does a lot of the times. But I think that a lot of the times she doesn't address the fact that death is not as accessible as she wants it to be and as she would like to make it out to be, in terms of like low income families and people that can't afford to have a home burial or anything like this. I just feel like that is a place where she is lacking more coverage, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
She's always talking about death positivity and, historical death events and like very interesting things, and, making death like a more palatable and comfortable subject to talk about. But, low income families aren't trying to have a home viewing. It's stuff like that where it kind of falls short, I think, with a lot of her content.
I can definitely agree with that. She also tends to go in on like embalming a lot and like advocating against embalming. And like maybe this is just kind of like what was instilled in me, but I do still see there being a value in embalming, like especially for those who want to have services like much later than like the date of death, and like are uncomfortable with seeing like a deceased body in its natural state. Because embalming, like truly, it does give us the best chance of attempting to restore someone to like a more pleasant viewing state, especially if you're gonna have like hundreds of guests come to attend a visitation, and like not all of them are gonna be comfortable with how like an active death looks.
And sometimes it's not an option. There is a crisis right now as to where there are not enough forensic pathologists to do the work that is required of them. There are a lot of high density population areas where autopsies are delayed up to weeks. I have heard of this in multiple areas, and it's really, really disheartening, but it's true. If you are a low income family living in this metropolitan area and your son gets shot and the autopsy doesn't happen for 4 weeks, even if he's in a cooler, it's not, you can't have a funeral without embalming. I feel you could, but it would be extremely traumatic. Just stuff like that is where it's, you just have to be careful with your research and what you advocate for and what you say, because she has such a large platform, and so many people look to her for, all things death. I think you need to address some of these things as well.
For sure. And like the last thing, like I'm done, I'm stepping off. The last thing I'll say on like some of her reviews, something that she actually brings up a lot is that dead bodies are not inherently dangerous, which like I agree. Like I absolutely agree with that. I know the science behind it. Like even like like the bacteria that aid decomposition, like they themselves aren't even really dangerous to living beings. But there are things that make dead bodies dangerous that we cannot neglect. So, like people who have died with diseases like tuberculosis, COVID, AIDS, hepatitis, stuff like that. If there's a risk of bodily fluid contact, like if there was a trauma or an autopsy or like organ and skin donation, these bodies should be treated with cautious regard, because you can contract those diseases from those bodies. And like, even though these are a small percentage of death, we can't ignore this fact and pretend that like every untrained family member is prepared to deal with such a case like this.
I think, yeah, she does cover it a little bit, but she is very vocal about, the body's not going to hurt you. Just keep it in your home. It's fine. Some cases that's fine, some cases it's not. So, just got to be careful about that.
Exactly. Case by case basis always. But all of that, ranting aside, she does make a lot of unknown knowledge extremely accessible for the common folk. And I really greatly look forward to her future advancements in societal views on death and legislature reform regarding funerary practices. There definitely needs to be more advocates like her, and she's done a lot of good.
She's done a lot of good work, really. I do love her. It's kind of like that, you can love your friend and hate some of the things that they do, and that's totally fine.
Well, right, exactly.
But, yeah, I mean, everyone can always do better. She's not the perfect death advocate, and that's totally fine. But the work that she is doing and the moves she is making for the death care industry is really incredible. She's, like Red said, she's gotten legislation passed for certain aspects of alternative and green burials. She also has a podcast called Death in the Afternoon that I've listened to all of, and I would check out if you want to. It's more historical, but it's more of her content that I very much enjoy. So she's a great person to look up to, and I think she has a lot of good things to say about death. But also just remember to keep a critical eye, on anything involving that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no all-seeing power about these things, so it's always good to further your own research as well. So after all these books that I crammed through and that we've read along the way, I've learned a lot from the books that I read for the purpose of this episode. I think some of my biggest takeaways are to educate yourself and be open to new information, even when it changes and challenges things that you know. So be skeptic, try things that make you uncomfortable.
Yeah, like I said, it's good to read and expose yourself to new things, but I always like to remain critical and make sure that your mind should be open, but your thoughts also need to be your own. It's okay if you don't agree with everything that everyone's saying. It's okay if you don't agree that funeral directors should be telling funny stories about deceased people. But definitely keep an open mind, and these books are a great way to kind of delve into the death industry without getting your hands dirty, so to speak.
And we're really hoping to do more book reviews and things like that as the year progresses, maybe having minisodes with them, or doing a book club type segment during other topics. So there's so much media out there, and we really hope as we discover them, we can help you guys discover them too. And that's all for this week on MortMic. We'd like to connect with you guys on our socials, so follow, and subscribe to us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at MortMic Podcast. It would mean a lot to hear your feedback, so please tell us what you think in a comment and drop us a rating on whatever podcast hosting site that you use. If you have any suggestions on topics you'd like to hear about or burning questions that you might have on death, shoot us an email at mortmicpodcast@gmail.com.
I also want to give a huge thank you to our friend Marcin for the use of his song titled Deputies of Death, which he produced just for our show. You can check out his Bandcamp at marcinmusic.bandcamp.com. Thank you, Marcin.
And be sure to tune in the first Thursday of every month for more casual discussions on death. Thank you guys so much for listening. This has been MortMic.
Bye.
Bye.